A menu card printed on heavy cream-colored stock and dated April 14, 1912, sold at auction nearly a century later for tens of thousands of dollars. It listed 10 courses. It was the last dinner menu ever printed aboard the RMS Titanic, and what was written on it reads less like a ship's supper and more like a state banquet at a Parisian embassy. Number 13 was a cut of beef that cost more than a working family spent on food in a week. Number 4 was a delicacy made from the liver of a force-fed goose, served cold on toast points. And number 1 was not even solid food. Hit that subscribe button, because what the wealthiest passengers on Earth ate on their final night will change how you think about every meal that has ever been served at sea. Here are 25 foods actually served in first class on the Titanic's last night. Number 25. Cream of barley soup. The first thing ladled into bowls that night was not the showpiece. It was cream of barley soup, poured from silver tureens by stewards in pressed white jackets. Barley soup was a fixture of British and French fine dining at the turn of the century, a smooth, understated opening act meant to warm the palate without overwhelming it. On the Titanic, it was made from pearl barley, slow-cooked in rich stock, strained until velvety, and finished with fresh cream. The passengers had 2 soup options that evening, and if cream of barley sounds plain, consider that in 1912, a cup of soup this refined was the mark of a kitchen with serious discipline. It signaled what was coming. Every course that followed would be more elaborate than the last. Number 24. Creamed carrots. Among the sides listed under the roast course, creamed carrots barely drew a glance from the diners that night. But in the Titanic's galley, nothing was simple. The carrots were peeled, blanched, and finished in a rich cream sauce by a team of French-trained cooks working in a kitchen the size of a small hotel's. This was not boiled carrot and butter work. The White Star Line hired classically trained chefs to run its first-class kitchens, and even the humblest vegetable on the plate had to meet a standard that most restaurants on land could not touch. Creamed carrots in a first-class dining saloon on the largest ship ever built were not an afterthought. They were proof that no corner of the meal had been left unfinished. Number 23. Green peas. Fresh green peas in the middle of the North Atlantic in April were not ordinary. The Titanic loaded its provisions at Southampton and topped them off at Cherbourg, France, and fresh produce had to last the entire crossing. The peas were served alongside the roast course, bright green and cooked just enough to hold their shape. In an era when most households ate preserved or canned vegetables through the winter months, a plate of sweet, fresh peas on a ship hundreds of miles from the nearest farm was a quiet luxury. No one at the table that night would have remarked on them. They were part of the backdrop, as unremarkable to first-class passengers as the linen napkins folded beside their plates. The kitchen stored tens of thousands of fresh eggs and thousands of pounds of produce for the voyage, and the peas were one small piece of that supply. Number 22. Boiled rice. Boiled rice sat on the menu as one of 6 accompaniments to the roast course. In a dining saloon filled with foie gras and filet mignon, plain boiled rice looks almost apologetic. But on the Titanic, it served a purpose. French cuisine used rice as a neutral bed for rich sauces, and the kitchen prepared it as a canvas, not a main event. Diners could take it or leave it. Most probably left it, but the fact that it was there at all says something about the philosophy behind this meal. Nothing landed on the plate by accident, and the rice was cooked in seasoned stock and shaped by hand, the same way it would have been done at the finest hotels in London or Paris. Even the simplest grain on the menu was deliberate. Number 21. Celery. In 1912, celery was not a diet snack. It was a status symbol. First-class tables on the Titanic featured tall, crystal celery vases. a holdover from the Victorian dining tradition where fresh celery displayed upright in a decorative holder told your guests that you had money to spare on perishables. The celery served that night was crisp, raw, and arranged for presentation. It appeared on the menu alongside the pate and the asparagus, grouped with cold delicacies that required no cooking but demanded impeccable freshness. Celery was one of the most perishable items loaded aboard at Southampton, and the fact that it was still crisp on the fourth night of the voyage was a testament to the ship's cold storage. Most homes in 1912 could not keep celery fresh for more than a day without ice. Number 20. Cold asparagus vinaigrette. The asparagus that night was cold, dressed in a simple vinaigrette, and presented alongside the pate and celery as part of a savory interlude between the roast course and the desserts. In early April, fresh asparagus was a seasonal luxury, and cold preparation was a deliberate choice. Warm asparagus could mask a tired stalk. Cold asparagus could not. Serving it chilled and dressed in nothing more than oil and vinegar was a confidence move, a kitchen saying the produce was so fresh it needed no disguise. The asparagus likely came aboard at Cherbourg, where French suppliers loaded the finest spring vegetables available. Eaten cold between rich courses, it was meant to cleanse the palate and signal the transition into the final stretch of the meal. Number 19. Vegetable marrow farci. Vegetable marrow farci was a stuffed squash, and if that sounds modest for first class, the preparation was anything but. Vegetable marrow is a large, mild summer squash popular in British and French kitchens at the turn of the century. Hollowed out and filled with a seasoned stuffing of minced meat, breadcrumbs, herbs, and sometimes mushrooms, then baked until the shell was tender and the filling set. It appeared on the dinner menu as a standalone course, listed between the fish and the roast, a placement that gave it a weight normally reserved for meat. The dish has mostly vanished from modern menus, but in 1912 it was a fixture of formal dining, the kind of course a chef could use to showcase technique without relying on the most expensive ingredients in the pantry. Number 18. Chateau potatoes. Chateau potatoes were peeled, trimmed into uniform barrel shapes, and roasted in clarified butter until golden on every side. The technique required patience and a steady hand, and it was one of the classic French preparations taught in every serious kitchen in Europe. On the Titanic, they were listed under the roast course, served alongside the sirloin, the duckling, and the lamb. The name carried weight. Chateau was not just a description of the cooking method, it was a signal that the kitchen was French-trained and working at a level most passengers would only encounter at a country estate or a top hotel dining room. Every potato was cut to the same size, every potato was turned by hand. That precision was invisible to the diner and absolutely essential to the cook. Number 17. Lamb with mint sauce. The roast course offered 3 meats, and lamb with mint sauce was the most traditionally British of the 3. The lamb was roasted on the bone and carved tableside by the dining saloon's carvers, served with a fresh mint sauce made from chopped spearmint, sugar, and vinegar. This was not French refinement. This was British country cooking elevated to ocean liner scale. The Titanic's kitchens were provisioned with thousands of pounds of fresh meat, and the lamb had been loaded at Southampton less than 4 days earlier. Mint sauce was a fixture of Sunday dinner in English households, and serving it in first class was a nod to the British passengers who made up a large share of the dining saloon. Even at a 10-course meal designed by French-trained chefs, the lamb with mint sauce said plainly, "This is still a British ship." Number 16. Sauté of chicken lyonnaise. Chicken sautéed with onions in the style of Lyon, one of the culinary capitals of France. The preparation was straightforward. Chicken pieces cooked in butter, finished with a generous pile of slowly caramelized onions and a splash of vinegar to cut the richness. Lyonnaise cooking was built on onions, and this dish was its signature export. On the Titanic, it sat on the menu alongside the filet mignon and the vegetable marrow, part of a course that gave diners a choice between French, British, and something in between. The chicken was not the star of the evening. Most passengers reaching for the filet would have passed it over entirely. But for anyone who recognized the name, chicken lyonnaise was a quietly impressive offering, a dish that told you at least one cook in the kitchen had trained in a proper French brigade. Number 15. Cucumbers. The cucumber served alongside the poached salmon course was so simple it barely warranted a mention on the printed menu. But there it was, listed in plain type. Cucumbers. Not pickled, not dressed, just fresh, sliced, and served cold as a garnish for the fish. In formal British dining, cold sliced cucumber was the traditional companion to salmon, and the Titanic's kitchen followed that convention without embellishment. What made it noteworthy was the logistics. A fresh cucumber in the middle of the Atlantic had been loaded in port days earlier and stored in the ship's massive cold rooms alongside thousands of other perishable items. Serving it raw meant it had to be flawless, no wilting, no soft spots. On a ship feeding over 2,000 people, keeping a cucumber perfect was not a small achievement. Number 14. Roast duckling with applesauce. The roast course was the centerpiece of the evening, and the duckling sat right in the middle of it. Roast duckling with applesauce was classic British-French crossover cooking, the kind of dish served at country manors and London hotels alike. The duck was roasted whole, its skin crisped and its fat rendered, and carved at the table. Applesauce was made fresh from cooking apples, sweetened lightly, and served as a counterpoint to the rich, dark meat. The Titanic loaded thousands of pounds of poultry for the voyage, and the ducks served that night were small-bodied birds, full of flavor. In 1912, roast duckling at a formal dinner was still a course of real distinction, a step above the everyday chicken and just below the prized squab that would appear later in the meal. If you think that menu sounds extravagant so far, the next few items change the scale entirely. Number 13. Sirloin of beef. The sirloin was the anchor of the roast course, carved from an enormous joint at the side of the dining saloon by a uniformed carver using a knife nearly as long as his forearm. This was British roast beef at its most ceremonial. The cut was seared and slow-roasted, served pink in the center, and accompanied by chateau potatoes and a rich juice. In 1912, a joint of beef this size cost more than many working families spent on food in an entire week. The Titanic carried tens of thousands of pounds of fresh meat in its cold storage, and the sirloin served to first class that night was among the finest cuts on board. Beef at this level was not something most people ate at home, even the well-off ones. It was something they expected when they boarded a ship that cost more to build than most cities spent in a year. Number 12. Consomma Olga. Consomma Olga was the other soup option that night, and it had nothing in common with the cream of barley. This was a perfectly clear, amber-colored broth made from veal or beef bones, meticulously clarified using a raft of egg whites and ground meat that trapped every particle of sediment as the stock slowly simmered. The process could take an entire day. When done right, the liquid was so transparent you could read print through it. What made Consomme Olga different from an ordinary consomme was the garnish, thin strips of sturgeon marrow, a gelatinous, almost translucent delicacy pulled from the spinal column of a sturgeon. Sturgeon marrow had been a fixture of Russian and Eastern European aristocratic dining for centuries, and by 1912 it was one of the rarest luxury ingredients in European kitchens. The sturgeon that supplied it came from the rivers of Eastern Europe or the Caspian region, and the marrow had to be carefully extracted, cleaned, and poached before it could go into the bowl. The name Olga pointed to the Russian aristocratic tradition that ran through French haute cuisine at the time. This was the era of escoffier, when Russian flavors had become fashionable in the dining rooms of Paris and London. Most passengers that night probably chose the cream of barley. It was familiar, comforting, and safe. But the ones who ordered the consomme Olga were eating a dish that connected the Titanic's kitchen to the oldest aristocratic dining traditions in Europe. A bowl of clear broth with a few strips of sturgeon marrow, served in a first-class dining saloon on a ship that would be on the ocean floor by morning. The cost of those ingredients alone would have been extraordinary. Sturgeon was already growing scarce by the early 20th century, and the marrow was considered even more precious than caviar by those who knew what they were eating. That a ship's kitchen could source it, prepare it, and serve it in the middle of the Atlantic was a quiet statement about what the White Star Line considered standard for first class. Number 11. Waldorf pudding. Waldorf pudding was a warm, molded dessert made from apples, walnuts, and sponge cake, named after the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. The connection was no accident. The Waldorf Astoria was one of the most famous hotels in the world at the turn of the century, and its kitchen had become a reference point for fine dining on both sides of the Atlantic. A Waldorf pudding on the Titanic's menu was a nod to the American passengers heading home and to the transatlantic culture that the ship itself represented. The pudding was baked in a mold, turned out onto a plate, and served with a sweet sauce. It was warm, dense, and comforting, a landing pad after 10 courses of increasingly elaborate food. The Waldorf name carried enough weight in 1912 that no further explanation was needed on the printed menu. Number 10. Fresh fruits and cheese. The final savory course was a platter of fresh fruits and a selection of cheeses, served together as the meal wound toward coffee and cigars. In 1912, a cheese course at the end of a formal dinner was standard French practice, and the Titanic's kitchen stocked hundreds of pounds of cheese for the voyage. The fruits had been loaded fresh at Southampton and Cherbourg: grapes, apples, pears, oranges, whatever was in season and could survive the crossing. This was not a dramatic course. No sculpted sugar, no flames, no presentation pieces. Just good cheese and ripe fruit on a plate, passed around a table of people who had been eating for close to 3 hours. For some of those passengers, it was the last solid food they would ever eat. Number 9. Chocolate and vanilla eclairs. The eclair course was one of several desserts offered simultaneously, and the Titanic's pastry kitchen produced them by the tray. Each eclair was made from choux pastry, a temperamental dough that requires precise ratios of butter, flour, eggs, and water, piped, baked until hollow, and filled with either chocolate or vanilla custard before being glazed on top. The Titanic employed a dedicated pastry chef and a team of bakers who worked through the night preparing desserts, breads, and rolls for the following day. On this night, those eclairs were finished and plated by the time the roast course was being cleared. A chocolate eclair does not sound like a luxury item by modern standards. But in 1912, when most of the world had never tasted chocolate in pastry form, it was a small and refined indulgence. Number 8. Peaches in chartreuse jelly. This was one of the more unusual desserts served that night, and one of the hardest to picture from a modern kitchen. The dish was a set jelly made with chartreuse, a bright green herbal liqueur produced by Carthusian monks in the French Alps, with poached peach halves suspended inside. When unmolded, it shimmered on the plate, a vivid green dome with golden fruit visible through the surface. Chartreuse was one of the most expensive and exotic liqueurs in the world in 1912, distilled from a closely guarded recipe involving dozens of herbs and botanicals. Using it as the base for a single dessert course at a ship's dinner was the kind of extravagance that only made sense on a vessel where first-class passengers were paying the modern equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars for a single crossing. Number 7. French ice cream. French ice cream was listed as its own course, separate from the other desserts, and it bore little resemblance to what most people buy at the store today. French-style ice cream in 1912 was an egg custard base, richer and denser than the American variety, churned by hand in the Titanic's pastry kitchen. The ship carried its own ice-making equipment, and the pastry team produced ice cream fresh every day of the voyage. The standard rotation for formal service was vanilla, strawberry, and coffee. What made it a luxury was the labor. Hand-churned custard-based ice cream required constant turning, careful temperature control, and a base that had to be cooked perfectly, or it would curdle. On a ship with engines vibrating through every floor, making it smooth was an act of quiet stubbornness by a kitchen that refused to cut a single corner. Number 6. Roast squab on cress. Squab is a young pigeon, and in 1912 it was one of the most prized birds in European fine dining. Not the pigeons on city streets. These were domesticated birds, bred for the table, slaughtered young enough that the meat was still tender, dark, and intensely flavored. Roast squab on a bed of fresh watercress appeared on the Titanic's menu after the roast course and before the desserts, in a position the French call the cold kitchen interlude, a palate shift between the heavy meats and the sweet courses ahead. The birds were roasted whole, each one small enough to serve as a single portion, and the watercress beneath them was more than decoration. Cress had a sharp, peppery bite that cut through the richness of everything that came before it. By this point in the evening, diners had already eaten soup, fish, filet mignon, a full roast course with 3 meats, and a frozen champagne punch. The squab was a reset. What set it apart from the other proteins that night was its rarity on ordinary tables. Chicken was common, duck was available at good hotels, but squab was reserved for the highest tier of formal dining, a bird that most working people in 1912 had never tasted and many had never heard of. Serving it on a ship, perfectly roasted and timed to arrive at exactly the right moment in a 10-course sequence, required a kitchen operating at peak coordination. Dozens of cooks worked the first-class galley that night, and the squab course was one of the moments where every station had to deliver at the same time. Outside the dining saloon windows, the Atlantic was flat and black and colder than it had been all voyage. The squab was warm, the cress was sharp, and there were still 3 courses to go. Number 5. Poached salmon with mousseline sauce. The fish course was poached salmon dressed in mousseline sauce, and it was one of the most technically demanding dishes on the entire menu. Mousseline sauce is a variation of hollandaise, lightened with whipped cream and finished just before service. It curdles if the temperature slips by a few degrees. Making it for hundreds of diners in a ship's galley with no room for error was the kind of task that separated a trained brigade from a competent one. The salmon itself was poached gently in a barely simmering court bouillon until the flesh was just set and still translucent at the center. Overcooked salmon in 1912 was the same failure it is today. The fish was served with cucumbers as the only garnish, and that simplicity was the point. A properly poached salmon with a perfect mousseline sauce needed nothing else. It was the quiet test that revealed whether a kitchen knew what it was doing, and on the Titanic, the kitchen passed without question. Number 4. Pâté de foie gras. Pâté de foie gras, made from the fattened liver of a force-fed goose, was one of the most expensive single ingredients served that night. The foie gras on the Titanic almost certainly came from the southwest of France, where producers in the Périgord and Alsace regions had been raising geese for this purpose for centuries. It was served cold, sliced from a terrine, accompanied by celery and toast, and it appeared on the menu after the roast course in the position where French tradition placed its most refined cold offerings. Foie gras was not controversial in 1912. It was simply the pinnacle of what money could buy at the table. A single terrine could cost as much as a working person earned in a week. The passengers eating it that night were not thinking about what it cost. They were thinking about how it tasted, rich, smooth, buttery, and unlike anything else on the plate. Number 3. Filet mignon's lily. Filet mignon's lily was not an ordinary steak. The dish was a celebrated French creation, small rounds of beef tenderloin, seared and served on a base of artichoke hearts filled with foie gras, finished with a truffle-studded sauce. 3 luxury ingredients on a single plate: truffle, foie gras, tenderloin. Each one, on its own, would have been the most expensive item on most restaurant menus in 1912. Together, they were a statement about what first class on the Titanic actually meant. The artichoke hearts were trimmed by hand, one at a time, and filled with the same foie gras that appeared later as its own course. The truffles were shaved fresh over the top. The sauce was built from wine and stock reduced until it coated the back of a spoon. This was not a dish that could be prepared in advance and held warm. It was cooked to order, plated in the kitchen, and carried to the table by stewards who understood that a cold filet mignon was not a filet mignon at all. Number 2. Oysters. The very first thing placed in front of first-class passengers that night was a plate of raw oysters, not cooked, not baked, not dressed with anything but their own liquor and a wedge of lemon. In 1912, oysters were the opening statement of any serious formal meal, the signal that what followed would be worth the next 3 hours of your evening. The oysters were shucked to order by the kitchen team and served on crushed ice. Eating raw shellfish on a ship in the middle of the ocean required a cold storage system and supply chain that most restaurants on dry land could barely manage. The passengers did not think about any of that. They squeezed the lemon, tipped the shell, and swallowed. It was the simplest course of the night, over in seconds, and the one that set the tone for every plate that followed. By the time the empty shells were cleared, the first soup course was already on its way. Number 1. Punch romaine. Punch romaine was not a dessert and not a drink. It was something in between, a frozen slush of champagne, white wine, rum, and citrus, served in the middle of the meal as a palate cleanser between the roast course and the cold course. In French formal dining, this was called a trou normand, a hole in the meal, a deliberate pause to reset the stomach before the final act. On the Titanic, it was served in small crystal cups, icy and sharp, and for most passengers, it was the single most refreshing moment of the entire evening. The ship struck the iceberg at 20 minutes before midnight. Between punch romaine and that moment, there were still 4 courses to come, cigars to light in the smoking room, and a ship that everyone on board believed could not sink. Nobody lingered over the punch romaine. It was gone in a few sips. But of every item on the menu that night, it is the one that food historians write about most because it captures the entire evening in a single glass. Extraordinary luxury, absolute confidence, and no idea at all of what was less than 2 hours away. Every item on that menu was real, printed on a card that passengers held in their hands on the evening of April 14, 1912. 10 courses, 25 foods, and a kitchen running at the peak of what the early 20th century could accomplish, aboard a ship that would be on the ocean floor by sunrise. If you could sit down to one course from that table tonight, tell us which one in the comments. And if this kind of history keeps you coming back, hit subscribe. The next one is already on its way.